It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Dr. Anthea Rhodes is a paediatrician, a researcher, child health advocate, and the director of the Royal Children's Health Poll. And Andrea has jumped into this Doctor's Desk episode to have a chat about a recent poll that you did about concussion. Anthea, thank you so much for joining me. With a cycling background, I have had a lot to do with concussion. While it hasn't happened to me, there are plenty of people who fall off bikes and bang their heads, and I've watched it happen in races where people get back on the bike and ride and they clearly shouldn't be riding. You've conducted this poll not about cycling, but about concussion in kids, not just from sport, but from everyday life. If you were to summarise in, 15 seconds or less what your general research question was, what were you most curious about here?
We were really keen to learn whether parents understand how concussion can happen, what the signs might be if it has happened to your kid, and how they know to support them and get them back, fully functioning into sport and activities. When is it safe? What do they need to do to make sure the child recovers well?
Before we talk about the practical aspects of this and what people need to know about concussion, how well versed were Aussie mums and dads on concussion generally?
So around 1 in 3 said they knew very little or nothing at all about concussion. And we found that when we asked them specifically about some of the signs and symptoms, the way concussion might show up in a child, when it came to non-physical signs, so that might be things like difficulty concentrating, it might be fatigue, might even be changes in mood, that around half of parents weren't aware that those sorts of signs and symptoms in a young person or child might actually be as a result of concussion.
Okay, a couple of quick questions for you, really rapid fire. Does concussion always have to come from a bump on the head?
Absolutely not. So what happens when a child gets concussion, or an adult, is the brain moves quickly inside the skull and knocks up against that hard bony surface. And it's that contact that causes the injury that's generally temporary to the brain cells. So it can happen in any mechanism where the head moves quickly. So that actually might be a blow to the body. So, for example, a tackle, whether that's in sport or in the backyard, that can be enough for actually the brain to move really quickly inside the head and forcefully against the skull. Most commonly, though, it will be a knock to the head itself.
Okay, I'm even thinking something happening on the trampoline could be enough.
Absolutely. Trampoline, definitely a culprit for lots of accidents and injuries. We know that it's also a great place for kids to have fun and stay fit, but definitely even without blacking out, which commonly parents didn't understand, around a third of parents thought kids will always lose consciousness or black out if they've had a concussion. In fact, most commonly they don't. So what they might do is look a little bit drowsy, perhaps a bit wobbly on their feet for a minute or two, and then they might appear to just get on with things. And that's where it's really important to know that they actually stop what they're doing. And the main reason for that is that knock on the head can change their reaction time, the way that they're processing things, and puts them at risk of a second injury, particularly if they're playing sport at the time.
Anthea, that was questions 2 and 3. So question 2 was, do you have to be knocked unconscious to have a concussion? Obviously, the answer is no. And the third one was, is it okay to get back into it if you have taken some kind of a hit, some sort of a knock, if your brain has bashed up against the inside of your skull? And again, the answer is no. I remember watching a cyclist have a crash and get back on the bike, and he was taking his life in his hands. I mean, he couldn't ride straight because his brain had obviously been so... Is discombobulated the right word? Can I use discombobulated? I think it's a fun word.
I think it's a good word because we can understand the sense of what that means. So it's really hard to see the brain. Obviously, we can't see it. If your child takes a knock to their arm or their leg, it might look a bit red. They might be holding it, nursing it. And it's really obvious something's happened. And you probably wouldn't continue on with normal activity if it looked like something was happening. We can't see the brain. So instead, we have to see the way it affects your child's behaviour. And so that is, if they look like they're staggering a bit, if they seem a little bit confused, or in the following days, if they seem slowed down, fatigued, that's that injury taking its time to heal, just like it would in any other body part.
Yeah, the word that springs to mind for me is wonky. Not just physically wonky, but maybe a bit emotionally or socially wonky, or just not quite there. I have 2 more quick questions for you. First of all, when do you know that your kids are okay to get back into it? That's the first one.
So we've got great guidelines on the Children's Hospital website, actually, Kids Health Info Fact Sheet, returning to school and sport, because it will be different for every child. Essentially, not at all within the first 48 hours. There needs to be a slowed down period, not regular activities. It doesn't have to be strict bed rest like we might have done back in the day, but quiet time and generally time away from the screen, because that's quite stimulating and that's giving the brain a workout when what it needs is rest. And then in the following days, it's about gradual return to activity. Firstly, back to school, and once fully back and coping with school, then it's back to sport. Generally, for most kids, that will take somewhere between 5 days up to 3 weeks at the most. Some children, it's really quick. If it's continuing on more than 2 to 3 weeks, then that's a prolonged recovery and you would be wanting to check in with your doctor for some advice.
The last question for you, Dr. Anthea Rhodes, the Director of the Royal Children's Health Poll, paediatrician and child advocate. Prevention's tricky when it comes to something like concussion. We obviously don't want to see our kids concussed. The ramifications can be serious, but we also don't want to cotton wool our kids. We don't want to have them all bubble wrapped and not living their lives. So this idea of having them play games like soccer and head the soccer ball, or play footy and tackle somebody, it's actually fun to live life and play these sports. How do we get this balance right so that we're not being overprotective, the kids are living full, balanced, healthy, outdoors, active lives? What do we do here?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, and there are some good rules of thumb. So there are increasingly regulations in sport that minimise the really high-risk activities, like heading the soccer ball, like full body contact in football-based sports. We know that those activities are high risk for concussion, and in younger children, so generally those kids who are, at the moment, the guidelines are usually under 14, those sorts of activities are actually banned in most of those sporting codes now. That's a sensible thing to be doing because we know the risk of a concussion is high in those sorts of activities. But most concussions actually happen in pretty regular stuff. So it might be tackling in the backyard, it might be a game of sport that doesn't involve contact. Still a very common place for concussion. Young kids, it's primarily in a playground, perhaps they have a fall, or it might even be at home where they bump their head on the wall, rounding the corner too fast. So we can't prevent everything. Important to be sensible when it comes to some contact sports. People often ask about helmets. The big takeaway about a helmet is that a helmet will not prevent concussion. It's a great thing to wear for all kinds of head injury, absolutely on bikes, scooters, skateboards, in some sporting codes where helmets are required or recommended. But remembering that the brain moves quickly inside the skull, that's what causes the concussion. If you've got a helmet on, that's still going to happen. Helmet will protect you from an outside blow and other sorts of head injuries. It's not going to protect you from concussion. So if your child's wearing a helmet, they could still get concussed if they've had a blow to the head or body. So remember that. And finally, not getting back to activity too early is actually the best way to prevent a second concussion. Because if kids are engaging in sport and physical activity and their reaction time's slowed and they're a bit wonky or foggy, as you talked about, that's when they're really high risk for a second head injury, and that's where things can get really serious.
Dr. Anthea Rhodes is a paediatrician, researcher and child health advocate and the director of the Royal Children's Health Poll. Hey, Anthea, thanks so much for what you've shared.
Pleasure. Thanks, Justin.
The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon. From Bridge Media, Craig Bruce is our executive producer. For more information about making your family happier, please visit us at happyfamilies.com.au.